Since we recorded last, a little memory came back to me.
Yes.
I was waiting at the bus stop and I suddenly remembered a novel that I read about 7 years ago.
Okay.
Which is a science fiction novel from the 90s, largely set in a sewage treatment plant.
Of course you have. The audience won't be able to see what's on the other side of the camera, but Michael's got the most extensive science fiction collection I've ever seen. I'm not shocked that so much ground is covered between all of these books that you have on this topic.
Slow River by Nicola Griffith, which is a queer science fiction novel from the 90s about a woman who ends up working in a sewage treatment plant. Sewage treatment technology, mainly fictitious sewage treatment technology, is very important to the plot.
Oh, okay.
I won't give any more away.
No.
But I suddenly remembered reading it and really enjoying it 7 years ago, reading it on a train journey, and thought I should mention it because probably most people have not read a science fiction novel centered around sewage treatment.
Very few.
And I would recommend it for people wanting to broaden their reading horizons.
What's it called again?
Slow River by Nicola Griffith.
Fantastic. So, picking up from our last episode, where we were introduced to the idea that our rivers are full of poo. When it comes to the rivers and understanding precisely what the problems are here, there's so much to it. And even with the poo dimension, there's all these different facets to it. We have the human poo that we learned about in the last episode and how it finds its way into our rivers as well. But depending on where you live in Nottinghamshire or even around the country, it may be the case that animal poo is actually the bigger source of pollution and more detrimental in that area.
This is from farms, not dog walkers.
Yeah. Mostly from farms. I'm sure the dog walkers do make up a small percentage somewhere, but like nothing statistically significant. What's happening here is as we are using more intensive methods for farming, we're trying to get more animals, more plants being cultivated and reared in a smaller space. These areas are creating greater concentrations for potential pollution. And so even though farmers often do excellent jobs in storing their fertilizers, storing their animal waste, what can often happen is even with the best of intentions, it washes off into the river. And what's curious about this is particularly for animals that are reared outside. So this can be free range organic animals. So for example, chickens that are bred outdoors as well, that have a lot of outdoor space. It's hard to collect all of that waste. And so what happens is it sits on the ground, it'll rain, and that rain will wash off a lot of this waste into the river directly. And so it's not being treated, it just goes straight into the water. And that causes a very similar problem to what happens when we get human poo in the water as well. And so we've got the human poo coming in, we've got the animal waste coming in. And depending on where you are in the Trent Basin, you'll have different types of animal pollutions. For example, in Staffordshire and Derbyshire, it's farming from livestock, which is a significant source of pollution. So that could be things like cattle, it could be things like sheep. In Nottingham, the bigger source of pollution is actually less the animals than the chemical fertilizers for plants that gets into rivers. I'll talk about the difference between those in a second. And in Lincolnshire, where the Trent passes through as well, it's the chickens that are the problem. So there's sort of two strands to this. One is we've got the fertilizers, artificial fertilizers being used by farms. And from there, what we've got is nitrates and phosphates. Those are the sort of chemicals that are used for fertilizers. They get into the water and they're supposed to help plants on land grow quicker, so that they help the farmers' crops grow quicker, they get higher yield. But what happens is it encourages the growth of certain plants in the river as well, particularly algae, because algae is the thing that grows the fastest. Because algae can use these fertilizers quicker than slower growing plants, what you get is the river's just full of algae. The algae dies, it decomposes. As it decomposes, it uses up all the oxygen in the river. All the other animals and small invertebrates also perish as a result. With the poo, it's bacteria. That's the problem. Okay. So whether it's human waste or animal waste, that's what leads to our Trentbelly. Trentbelly isn't linked to a specific infection, but it can be E. coli, it can be salmonella, And it's effectively a gastrointestinal infection.
Okay.
And that bacteria feeds on the waste.
Could be anything that comes from poo.
Yes.
So it's like a lucky dip of
it is. It is.
gastroinfections.
Yeah. And some of them are worse than others. So there's a particularly nasty disease called leptospirosis, also known as Weil's disease, which you can also get in the Trent. That comes from rat urine specifically. And that is supposed to be like norovirus. If anyone's had norovirus, leptospirosis is supposed to be like that, but times 10. That's particularly bad. And so all of these things we know as Trentbelly, some of them are, none of them are nice, but some of them are like horrendous. And some of them are just hugely unpleasant. I'm Tom Sokorechka.
And I'm Michael Krawick.
From Notspod.
This is Trentbelly.
Episode 2, Beyond the Poo Dimension. In the last episode, we talked about the role of storms in overwhelming sewage treatment works. Storms also have a massive role to play in farming too, and also bringing other pollutants into rivers in urban areas. Because what happens is, particularly when you've had a spell of dry weather, you'll have a lot of pollutants just sat on the ground. And that can be on the farm, that could be on a road in an urban area. And what happens is they sort of just build up during the dry weather. And then when you get a big storm event happening, everything all at once gets washed into the river. And that's when you get things like the fish kills as well. It's when everything comes in all at once. The more storms that we have, the more we're going to have these huge spikes of all kinds of pollutants entering the river. I think there can be this view that the pollutants entering the river happens as a kind of drip, 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 quite steady over time. That's not really what recent evidence is showing us. It's quite punctuated with links to big storm events washing everything off into the river altogether.
So this means that during big storms, you also get the extra animal poo from the farms flooding into the rivers at the same time as the extra human poo.
That's right.
And all of the pollutants on roads and everything else that is sort of sitting around waiting patiently to go into the rivers.
Biding its time. So we've had a very wet winter, and we've also had, in recent years, very dry summers too. And it's hard to link specific weather events to climate change. It's hard to look out the window and say, that's climate change today. It wasn't yesterday, but it is today. I know that. But what we can do is we can sort of look at the average over time. And the more we get large periods of time where it's very dry, periods of time where all the rain is concentrated into short time periods as well, it's actually going to make the pollution worse, even if there's no more pollutants entering the river, because of the way it gets stored and released, stored and released, stored and released. Whereas if we had weather that was milder, a bit more consistent, then the pollutants would be entering the river at a lower but more consistent rate and would be doing less damage as a result.
For a comparison point, we could say that if we're just getting a little bit of pollution regularly going into the rivers, it's like drinking one little whiskey every night before bed. Whereas if we're having these storm events after a big dry spell, it's like downing 3 bottles of whatever cheap brand makes you go, ugh. In the last episode, we talked about Stoke Bardolph being originally a sewage farm, and they still do grow crops there.
Yeah.
Are we still using human poo as fertilizer?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, right? So what we do is we do our poo in the toilet. That then goes to the sewage treatment plant. And then the idea is that they treat it and then it's dealt with. What can happen is that waste is sent from our toilets, from businesses, to a sewage treatment plant. And that is then sold to farmers to then use as fertilizer on their farms. Some of it will no doubt do the job that it's intended to do. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it at all. But what can happen is spread on the farms, can rain, and it then washes off into the rivers. And when I think about our last episode, when you were talking about how...
So you'd either have open sewers in the streets flowing into the river, or a cesspool where it would like rot and eventually be taken to a farm, or go on a barge to go to a farm. So yeah, you've got either directly going into the river or going to Victorian era farms. It's interesting that last episode we talked about how the Victorians came up with the sewage system to reduce river pollution, to redirect sewage to farms. But even after doing that, the sort of excess sewage on those farms still ends up leaching into the rivers eventually, because there's just if it's so concentrated in one place, it doesn't get absorbed by all the crops. So it eventually goes back into the river still. So if farms are still using human sewage for fertilizer, are we potentially facing the problem that Stoke Bardolph now has, where the crops it grows are unfit for human consumption? Because farmers will be buying this cheap fertilizer, possibly from water companies, and don't necessarily know how well treated it is, how toxic it is. And potentially there's the risk that it will make the farmland that they're spreading it on not safe to grow human crops on in the future. So it's just something to be aware of there.
Yeah,
and just a little thing to worry about.
I know. And it's kind of terrifying, because this is perfectly legal, and you might think, okay, if it's legal, then it's safe. But there are some countries that have decided that this is so unsafe, using human waste on farmland, that it is illegal. The Netherlands is one example in which they do this. And so what they do in the Netherlands with a lot of their waste is they will incinerate it, because they don't believe that they can use it for fertilizer. Now, what comes out the incinerator, they actually do sometimes use that for fertilizer.
Okay.
But the idea is the incineration process will kill off particularly a lot of the bacteria that we talked about earlier. There was a curious incident a few years ago in which the incinerator malfunctioned. It was unable to process the waste anymore. And so in the Netherlands, they had this massive buildup of sewage. And they thought, what can we do with it? And they sold it. They sold it to which country, Michael? They sold it to the United Kingdom. And we imported a lot of the human sewage from the Netherlands to spread on our farms, because for us, there's no laws against that.
It is kind of weird to think of Britain volunteering to take in other countries' sewage.
Yeah, that's right.
To put it on our land.
Yes.
When we know from examples that could potentially make our land unfit for growing crops on in the future. But I guess when we're addressing these issues, there's the economics of it, where cheap fertilizer is cheap, and that means we can grow stuff now. And if we are pressed for money and everything, we are not able to think properly about the long-term consequences, because we just need to make sure we grow enough this year to be able to sustain ourselves for a bit longer. When we were looking into this, there's some people campaigning that quite villainize the farmers for this. And you definitely can argue that farmers are not doing enough to reduce river pollution. You can go down that route. But if we are ignoring the economic aspect of farmers in this country don't actually make that much money and therefore do not have the spare money to invest in better ways of dealing with this, don't necessarily have the spare cash to calculate the exact amount of fertilizer that they need. One of the sources I read said that in order to keep costs down, farmers will spread fertilizer as few times as possible so that they saves on fuel costs for the tractor and labor costs. If you can just get all your fertilizer and spread it on the ground in as few passes as possible, rather than doing small amounts multiple times, which would be better for the crops in terms of being able to absorb that quantity, wasting less because it's not flowing into the river, but you then have to pay for all the extra costs of doing that. The impression we got is that farmers are not maliciously cackling as they pollute the rivers. They would like to do more and address this issue. Farmers like that their families have often managed the land for decades or centuries and are very proud of their connection with the land and don't want their local river to be polluted.
Yeah, there's that phrase in farming, isn't there, which is sort of live as if you'll die tomorrow, farm as if you'll live forever. Something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. And the idea is, there's a pride in this stewardship, as you suggest.
When we look at it from not being farmers, very easy to be like, God, they just don't care, do they?
Yeah.
If we want to reduce the impact of farms on our rivers and the consequences of that, we would have to have a significant change to the way we farm our food, what we expect from our food prices, and probably also what we eat regularly. And that's probably too big of a topic to discuss on this podcast about river pollution. However, I did read a good book called Ravenous, which was written by the guy who did the national food strategy for the government. Then when the government didn't implement it, he wrote this book to angrily complain about how they hadn't followed his advice. That has a lot of suggestions on how to reform farming and food in the UK, and that's probably a good source to follow up this with.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because we recognise that farming's really, really hard. There's a lot of pressure that farmers are under. They don't get paid a huge amount of money, or certainly a lot of them don't. Nonetheless, farming practices are a significant source of pollution from the fertilizers, from the animal waste. And so something needs to be done. It's probably worth spending a bit of time just talking about how farms are monitored. There is a government organisation called the Environment Agency, and the Environment Agency is going to feature very heavily in subsequent episodes as well. Effectively, what happens is the Environment Agency will send inspectors round to walk around the farm, just check that everything's being stored correctly, that there aren't things obviously leaching out, and sort of the best practices are upheld. It used to be the case a few years ago that these were very rare. It seems like the new government is taking this monitoring a lot more seriously and has actually doubled the funding for it to try and get more of this monitoring done. But it's things like, where are you storing your fertilizer? What are you doing with your waste? That kind of, is it all kept in appropriate conditions? So when it does rain, you have some kind of storm event. It doesn't just all go into the river, and that's in everyone's best interest. It's worth saying as well that I use this term inspection. It's not like they will just turn up in the middle of the night, just smash the door down. Wait, we'll shake the inspection's here. You better be ready, boy. And they sort of just tie them up so they can't do anything while they walk around the farm. It's not like that. There's very much a collaborative effort. It's got the sort of support of the NFU, the National Farmers Union, as well. It is them working together. So I just want to stress that even though when we sort of use this term inspection, it might conjure up something quite extreme and quite combative, and that's not actually the case. And the idea is, if standards aren't being met, which can happen, then the idea is, again, they work together to find a solution, because it's not in the interests to alienate farmers and make them feel like caring about the land is just another thing that they have to do so the government can tick a box. It is really something that we want everyone to care about, everyone to buy into.
According to George Monbiot, in his book, which is a few years old now, Regenesis, a farm on average could expect an inspection from the Environment Agency about pollution once every 263 years. You're saying that the current government has doubled the budget, so that makes it once every 132 years.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're a farmer listening to this, best get your affairs in order, because your great-grandchildren will be in for a shock. With the Environment Agency, it's a question of resources, right? So they get a certain amount of funding. It isn't very much. It's been cut a lot. The view from insiders, from people I've spoken to at the Environment Agency, is it's doing its best with the funding that it's been given. No doubt, if they had the capacity to do more, they absolutely would. The Environment Agency is quite a big organisation. They regulate not just water, not just farms, but a lot of broader sort of environmental issues as well in the country. And I think there's a case to be made that more could be done. More could be done on this, and things are moving in the right direction, albeit, as you suggest, from a very low base.
When a farm has been inspected and maybe has been identified as not doing enough, there's also criticism that the agency doesn't really have teeth to do anything about that. But then we have the problem of, do we then want to lose a farm? If we just shut the farm down, that's one less source of food in the country. It's the people that are employed by the farm. It's potentially a family farm. So I can kind of understand why the Environment Agency would be reluctant to be aggressive on this, but then that kind of doesn't excuse them from not doing more. But then, as you said, your sources inside the agency say that they are doing the best they can with the resources. So I also don't want to be extremely harsh on an organization that I have not actually worked with in any
Yeah,
capacity.
cool. And we have to lay our cards on the table here and admit that if we made the Environment Agency out to be an organization that was viewed by farmers as an institution that's out to get them, to catch them out, to wait for them to trip up, I question how effective that would be to actually solving the problem.
Yeah, it just becomes like a overbearing hall monitor.
Yeah, that's right. And given how many moving parts are involved in this issue, my sense is that everything works so much better if all the different stakeholders collaborate with each other rather than pulling against each other.
Pollution from farms is a form of industrial pollution.
Yes.
Yeah. And that pollution from farms has increased over the years as farming has intensified. However, overall industrial pollution from other industries has declined because historically there were a lot more industries along the Trent which would pollute the river, and we don't have that anymore. So we used to have bleach and dye works, soap factories, metal finishing, car manufacturers, textiles, hosiery, and as well we had power stations built along the Trent from the 1920s onwards. There were 15 power stations along the Trent, so it was, according to various sources, the largest concentration of power stations in the world.
Wow.
And it was nicknamed Megawatt Valley.
Megawatt Valley.
The power stations started closing down from the 80s onwards, though, and we don't have them anymore. But the reason they were built was there was lots of coal in the area, which could reach the power stations very quickly. And the river was there where you could take water from the river to use it to cool things down and flush the water away. There's some descriptions of how the swans used to prefer the water by the power stations because it was warmer. The water that they've taken from the river to cool their stuff off comes back out and it's a higher temperature.
It's amazing that it makes that much of a difference.
According to a fisherman we spoke to, an angler,
true.
He said that in winter it was easier to fish by the power stations because all of the fish would gather where the warm water was coming out.
Makes sense.
Yeah. In summer, the temperature of the water by the power stations could exceed 30 degrees Celsius.
That's outrageous.
Yeah.
That's like swimming pool
Yeah.
temperature, isn't it?
And in winter, it could get to 15 degrees, which is very high temperature for winter. So you can see why the fish would... and the swans and everything would build up around that warm water because it's just like being a nice cozy jacuzzi. Another effect that the power stations would have had was from the coal.
Yeah, so as well as there being wastewater that would come out of the power stations, you'd also have just mining waste generally that had just been left over from the processing of the coal. And that would just be kept in a big old pile. And when it rains, water infiltrates through this pile, picks up various pollutants, washes into this river. One of those pollutants is mercury. And mercury is a particularly nasty pollutant for a number of reasons. Historically, it's been associated with madness. So the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, that was supposed to be sort of inspired by people who at the time were exposed to high levels of mercury and it damaged their brains. We have that in the River Trent. The River Trent right now fails on its chemical tests because of mercury, amongst other things, but mercury being an important one. We don't have any new mercury coming in because many of the power stations have been closed down now. But once mercury is in the watercourse, basically stays there. It doesn't really go anywhere and it just sort of remains hanging around in the food chain. And that is why you should not eat fish that has come from the Trent because of high levels of mercury.
But Trentbelly is not mercury poisoning, even though you probably do get a bit of mercury.
It's extremely unlikely, unless you've been eating a lot of fish from the river and finding yourself ill from that.
Or swimming like a whale and getting loads of not krill, but the river equivalent.
Yeah, that's right. You won't get mercury poisoning from exposure to the Trent River water because it's not quite in high enough concentrations for that. So as long as you refrain from eating the fish, you should be okay from that. Yes.
Power stations, all these industries, lots of effects on the river. When it comes to industrial pollution, as a country, we've been less bothered about that compared to sewage pollution in the past. So last episode talked about how the sewage pollution was bothering people, how much it was affecting the rivers. But part of the reason to address that was because of how the sewage was affecting people before it reached the rivers.
Yeah.
So the open sewers in the streets and whatnot, there's a human cost to that. Whereas with industrial pollution, it's just going straight into the rivers. There's not as much of a drive to address that.
Yeah. I just wonder as well if when it comes to sewage, if there's just something psychologically more terrifying about excrement compared to this very long chemical name, which means nothing to people.
At the time when there's lots of bleach and soap works that were draining into the river, because of the very basic understanding of hygiene and science and things, they still believed in the miasma theory. Noxious smells and miasma was what made us ill, not the fact that there were things living in it that would make us ill. So when the soap, bleach and dye works were pumping stuff into the rivers, the logic at the time was that yes, there might be some nasty stuff going in, like unpleasant smelling stuff. But if you also pump in some nice smelling stuff like excess soaps and things, that sort of cancels it out and means that the river's probably fine because it's not as smelly.
Yeah.
Up until around the 1950s, there's not much being done about industrial pollution in our rivers. There are people looking at it, but they don't really have that much power.
Sure.
But from the 50s onwards, you get more regulation, more fines being issued. It's more in public consciousness. But by this point, the rivers are really bad. From the 50s, 60s onwards, you do get industrial pollution declining to the present day while the farming pollution increases. However, a lot of that decline is actually just because the industries aren't there anymore. There's an argument to be made that a lot of the regulation that was imposed on the industry didn't actually have that much of an impact on how much they were polluting, and it was the biggest impact is from all those industries either closing down or moving abroad.
Yeah, so we've spoken to quite a few people, haven't we, sort of about this, that have been using the river in various ways over the decades. And they've said, yeah, broadly speaking, actually, things have gotten a lot better in the river. And that's not down to better regulation, public awareness campaigns necessarily. It's more to do with the fact of basically deindustrialization. A lot of the sources of pollution have disappeared. Perhaps they've moved elsewhere. So instead of our rivers being polluted, that factory that polluted our river now exists somewhere else.
Yeah, it's polluting a river we can't see in a part of the world that we therefore don't care about.
Yeah, maybe we don't go down that rabbit hole. We just find out where all the factories have opened up around the world.
Yeah, so,
I don't think that's in the budget to visit and check.
So instead of polluting our local rivers, we've basically outsourced our pollution to other countries who have to deal with their rivers being really polluted. So whether overall pollution has decreased or has actually just been moved abroad is a topic that is a bit too big for a series focused on the River Trent. But we say that maybe. Let us know in the comments.
It's just not very satisfying though, is it? Because we'd like to think that this was through some coordinated effort on our part, and cleaning this up has required sort of grit and the sweat of the local people being galvanized into action. But it's not that. It's just our factories have closed down.
There, as well as that, there has been a lot of actual stuff being done to clean the rivers. But whether in comparison to the factories closing down, that's had as big of an impact is up for debate.
Yeah.
One of the articles I read for this was titled "The Unnatural History of the River Trent," which takes you through the decades, looking at different parts of the Trent and how they're differently polluted at different times. And one of the little fun facts in that, I say fun, is that there's a big spike in river pollution during and straight after World War II.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because when we go to war, we need to massively increase our munitions productions and our industry. During the war, industrial output increases because we're having to make a lot more munitions for the war. And as a result of that, you get more river pollution. It's understandable that during the wartime, you're not bothered about that.
Yeah.
But I find it as an interesting little nugget of information about how changes to human society impact the rivers.
Yeah.
And, as we then go into deindustrialization, we have the opposite impact of the rivers getting better because our industrial output is decreasing.
I feel like there's someone out there should do a PhD investigation of the impacts of World War II on freshwater invertebrates in the River Trent. There's something there.
It's got to be something there.
Yeah.
When we started looking into this, we were thinking about, the sewage. And then the more we looked into the many other ways that humans have changed our rivers, it's a massive topic.
Mate, it's absolutely huge. We started with the human side of things, human excrement, human waste. Talked about the animals as well. But there's even more than that. For example, forever chemicals. There's a number of different kinds, all of which are extremely difficult to pronounce. Forever chemicals being a sort of catch-all colloquial term for them. Like mercury, these are chemicals in which once they're in the environment, they just stay. And in a way, that's because they've been engineered like that. So these forever chemicals, we use them to make manufactured goods waterproof, for example, because they're completely unaffected by water. Water will not degrade them. We also use these chemicals to make things fireproof too, because fire will not touch them. Oil proof as well, where they're needed too. So these things are basically indestructible. We have engineered chemicals to protect everyday items, from clothing to pots and pans and that kind of thing. We have made these chemicals to be indestructible, but once they get into the water, they just don't go anywhere. They stay there, and like mercury, they sort of they bioaccumulate. They just keep on building up in the ecosystem. And likewise, we ingest food, we ingest fish, being one big source of them as well, into our bodies. And when they're in our bodies, they tend to stick around as well and lead to all kinds of health problems. For example, cancer, infertility, and to be honest, mate, the list is actually really long there.
Okay.
And the River Trent fails on that. It fails on mercury, and it fails on that too. We also have, in addition to this, which is quite a scary one, quite a new one, antimicrobial resistance. And so what this is the idea that because we're also finding in our watercourses increased levels of chemicals used for pharmaceuticals,
antibiotics,
and antibiotics, being part of that too. But really, all kinds of medicine is increasingly finding itself in our watercourses. And what that means is for the bacteria that live there, they can develop a resistance to antibiotics specifically. But other animals can have their behavior changed by these chemicals as well. Nottingham City, that bit between Trent Lock and up to past Newark to Cromwell, that is one of the best understood and best studied places for antimicrobial resistance, because it was part of a pilot study very recently which looked at a range of areas around the UK, some urban, some rural. Nottingham was picked as the urban area, and so in terms of antimicrobial resistance in urban areas, this in Nottingham is the best place to understand that. And the threat from that comes from bacterial infections that have this resistance. Very hard to treat. And so it can be the case, and they found this with E. coli, for example, which is something that is part of Trentbelly.
Yeah.
You can get this E. coli Trentbelly infection with all the horrible symptoms that come with it, but it's exceptionally difficult to treat for it because the bacteria is resistant as a function of everything that we flush down the toilet. And the source of this is also quite interesting too, because it can come from not just pharmaceutical companies and the industrial waste that they release, but also just from us with the medicines that we use at increased rates now.
I was in hospital a few months ago and on antibiotics there, and about an hour or so after having the antibiotic, my wee would smell very strongly of the antibiotic.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I wouldn't even have known that antibiotics have a smell associated with them.
Well, like, it smelled different to normal. Which
okay, yeah. I just trying to.
Oh, I wasn't sniffing it, thinking, yes,
I was just trying to conjure into my mind what an antibiotic, and I'm like, maybe there's like a scented candle somewhere that you can buy that it's a particular sort of antibiotic to have in your house.
The antibiotic will be in your body doing its job, but your body has to get rid of it. And
Yeah,
so
of course
it
it
goes
does.
down the toilet. Farmers use a lot of antibiotics to reduce infections in the cattle and sheep that they grow.
That's a big one.
And that's preemptive antibiotics. So they're giving it regularly to prevent infections from occurring rather than treating an existing infection. There's a lot of arguments about antibiotic use on farms being a major cause of antimicrobial resistance. So we have pharmaceutical waste, we have humans using medicines and then passing it out in our wee, and all the animal antibiotics as well that all end up in the rivers.
That's exactly right. One of the most interesting things that's come up in my research for this is there's a stream in the Peak District that has exceptionally high levels of these pharmaceutical chemicals in them. And it turns out that it's just downstream from a village that has an unusually high proportion of elderly people that live in it. And because elderly people are most likely to be on various kinds of medicine, it means that finds its way into the local watercourse, and it has some of the highest levels in the East Midlands area.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So it's particularly interesting, and you'd sort of reasonably expect, not wanting to single out a generation here, but because we have an aging population, more and more elderly people in the country. We often talk about that within the context of how we're going to be able to afford this, the strain on the NHS, but that does have an impact on our watercourses as well, in quite such a niche and like esoteric kind of way.
Everything's connected.
Yeah, everything's connected, man. Yeah.
When we're thinking of sewage pollution and industrial pollution and farming pollution and all the other types of pollution, it can be a bit challenging to think of, has the river got better or worse over time? Because in many ways it has got better. There is a overall decline in industrial pollution, but then we have these sort of newer forms of pollution like the antimicrobial resistance and the forever chemicals that are just there now. I guess in a lot of metrics, the river is better than it was at its worst in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s. There is cause for celebration there, even if we can still look at the river and go, should be better than this, really.
You're exactly right. And so we don't have any more mercury going into the river. These forever chemicals are actually banned as well. So we've got no more of them going into the river either. So there's a much greater awareness. But it also seems to be, with antimicrobial resistance being the most recent example, the more that we look into this, the better we understand our rivers, the more ways we realise we are damaging this very precious ecosystem, public resource. What's been happening over time is the requirements to determine whether a river is in good health or not have become more stringent. So, for example, back in 2016, it used to be the case that 97% of rivers had good chemical status, which means as far as the chemical pollutants were concerned, everything was all right. But then the regulations changed. They become a bit more stringent. They're looking at slightly different emphasis. And overnight, every single English river failed. So we go from 97% pass rate, every single river failing, because understandably over time, our standards are increasing. We want better rivers. And that's because of greater sort of public awareness, but also greater scientific awareness of what constitutes a healthy river too. So it looks like our rivers are getting worse from most of them having passed their chemical status and they're now failing. But actually that just reflects changing practices.
At a societal level, our knowledge of rivers has improved, and that's kind of made us more aware of ways in which we've damaged the rivers in the past.
Yeah. It's really interesting because we could get rid of all the sewage. Let's say we could do that. It's going to be extremely difficult for reasons which we explored in the last episode. But we'd still be dealing with a lot of pollutants. We wouldn't have a clean river. We've got the animal sewage. We've got the mercury. We've got the forever chemicals. We've got the antimicrobial resistance. And there are other things as well. I've just been talking about the things that are problematic for the Trent. But other rivers are going to have their own unique problems as well.
So I guess if we are increasing the monitoring, we're more aware of things that have gone wrong in the rivers. That does suggest that hopefully our rivers will improve over time, even if we overall become more aware of problems they face. I think maybe for our next episode, we should actually talk to someone who does this stuff for a living.
I think we've made a good start, Michael.
Yeah.
But from this point, it's become really clear that there's so much to this than what certainly I initially thought when I got this email about this student getting this thing called Trentbelly, that it's probably worth, let's bring someone in, see what they have to say about it, get some more insights, someone that's lived and breathed this stuff and can tie together all these different strands.
Yeah, let's do that next time.
That sounds like a good idea.
Thank you for listening, and join us next time where we will have, all going well, our first special guest.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with your friends. If you have any feedback or questions, you can get in touch via email, notspod@gmail.com, or leave a comment on YouTube. And for a list of books, articles, and other sources we used in our research, you can find a link in the episode description.